Delegates, honored guests, members of the school, and dear friends. My name is Michael Rusu, and it is my pleasure and privilege to serve as the president of the University of Birmingham United Nations Society. On behalf of our committee, I'd like to welcome you all to the 6th annual edition of the University of Birmingham Model Arab League Crisis Exercise. I am thrilled to see some old faces, as well as some new ones. Our Arab League Crisis Exercise is one of the largest of its kind in Europe, and it aims to provide a different way to approach Middle Eastern politics and diplomatic relations through a direct interaction of the delegates with the realities on the ground. As you will take your roles, you will be tested both physically and mentally, as we will create the context in which diplomacy can thrive should you rise up to the challenge. I have been asked many times, what is the purpose of simulating a situation that even the most seasoned diplomats have failed to diffuse after so much time and effort? As we act in our roles, we will provide an experience as similar as possible to the realities of today's international relations. Our aim, however, is not to focus on the present, but rather to provide a platform in which the international relations of the future can be created. As such, as I am looking across the room, I don't see delegates acting in a position of power, but the future diplomats of tomorrow, who will shape international politics across the globe in the decades to come. Henry Ford said that coming together is the beginning, keeping together is progress, working together is success. During this weekend, you are given the opportunity to go past historical tensions and attempt to provide more stability to the cabinet and the wider region. Working together will be difficult, but through dialogue and trust building, you delegates have the chance to be the example you want to see. Maybe taking a page from the history book and follow Henry Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy, or take advantage of the social events that you will attend, you have the opportunity to forge alliances and friendships that will walk towards a peaceful end. From this point forward, the future of the region is awaiting to be shaped by you. So meet everyone, build your friendships, leave no stone unturned, and take risks. Now, if the crisis director would like to make a statement. Yeah, sure.
Hi, I'm your crisis director. I don't need to write anything because I've read most of what you guys are going to do this weekend. Well, and these people at the front, they were brilliant. Applause for them afterwards. What I was going to say is, a lot of you have a bit of an issue with what crisis is. And what we're going to do is address that when you enter your crisis room, which will be after this speech. We have a little surprise for you, and you'll get to that in due course. But if you guys have an issue or anything, please do not feel free to talk to the chairs. They're brilliant. Talk to myself or any other members in the committee. We will spend about 20 minutes going over essentially rules of procedure, what is allowed, what is not allowed in the cabinet, and from there you can really thoroughly enjoy UoBMAL 2015. I yield my time to the chair.
As you will. Right, enough admin. It is my honor to invite our guest speaker to take charge. He's a professor of American Studies and International Relations in our very own university and the founder and editor of EA Worldview, a leading website in daily news and analysis of Iran, Turkey, Syria, and the wider Middle East, as well as UN foreign policy. He has recently completed 2 edited books on US foreign policy and power, The Trials of Public Diplomacy and the Limits of US Power, and is now working on a new book on how new media is reshaping foreign policy and international affairs. Talking today on the changing nature of diplomacy in the Middle East, US involvement, and the importance of information and disinformation in the region, please give a warm welcome to Professor Scott Lucas.
Thank you, folks. Can someone bring the computer up? Someone smart bring up the computer for me and put the tab on the far right side that says EA Worldview. Just so you can look at something if I get really boring, right? thank you to Micah, thank you to the committee, and thank you for the opportunity to hang out for a few minutes with you all. I'm not originally from around here. And way back when, I wasn't in Model UN, Model Arab League. I was over on the debating side of things, right? So while y'all were trying to resolve everything, I was basically saying, no, it ain't never going to work. And I can remember, as I introduced the theme of today's talk, which is Truth, Lies, and Diplomacy, I remember being in this very chamber a while back when there was another debater, a former world champion from Ireland, who's a law professor, and he and I were on opposite sides of the motion about the House of Lords. And at some point, I introduced a supposed fact, but I know it being a bit, what's that beautiful British phrase? A bit economical with the truth. Right? But we won the motion. And afterwards, he came up to me. He said, "You betrayed me." He said, He said, "You lied in a debating chamber." And I said, "Yeah." There's that nice standard that everything's truthful, everything's factual. Some academics actually believe that. And the fact is that of course what we're talking about is power today. Although I'm sure you all are all very truthful, nice people, this will be an exercise in power as much as diplomacy. And so I wanted to sort of introduce a couple of concepts from my own experience, because I simply never would say I could come in and give you answers. I mean, I have hard enough problems to answers in my own life. All I can do is say that you see the world from where you sit or where you stand. And so I've been fortunate in that I've been an academic for some time now, mainly in this country, but also have worked with universities in the Middle East and Iran, as well as in the States. But I've also been a journalist. I mean, that was my first job in the 1980s. And several years ago, I went back to it in a very unusual way. I wrote for various newspapers and magazines, in this country and then internationally. But what I thought was, look, if you want to have an influence as an academic, you have to wait 9 months, a year for something to be published as an article or as a book. Well, you know that in 24 hours how quickly things change. You're going to experience it here, right? So I want to be able to have input on a daily basis. And so a group of us started off initially working with what you call blog. Now, that's a dirty word for us now. I'll explain why in a minute. We started off with a blog, and we blogged on U.S. foreign policy, but several years ago we set up this website called EA Worldview. And EA Worldview initially started off to look at U.S. foreign policy around the world. It launched in November 2008, the night before Obama was elected president. But it very quickly changed. And it very quickly changed because, from our perspective, the world didn't work from the U.S. just going around and intervening everywhere. Despite the Iraq War of 2003, what we were seeing is if you want to understand the world, you want to understand diplomacy and information, you've got to go from the ground up. What changed us is that we saw, for example, this thing called Twitter. And I believe you all are conducting your diplomacy in a Twitter environment this weekend, if the press people told me correctly. We saw it. I was introduced to Twitter by my technical person on the night of the Mumbai attacks in 2008 in India. And we realized it was quicker to get information on the people who were there close to the attacks than you could through the official news media, because of the way that developed. But even more important, I think more relevant for what you all are discussing here is that a few weeks after that, in December 2008, was the Israeli war in Gaza, Operation Cast Lead. I presume we've got an Israel delegation here? We got a Palestine delegation here? Palestinian delegate. It always happens to them that way. We'll see if he or she tries to join the International Criminal Court in the next 24 hours. And what we saw in Gaza at that point is there was only one media, mainstream media outlet, which broadcast or reported in English from inside Gaza during that conflict, which was approximately a 6-week conflict, and that was Al Jazeera English. They were the only ones. CNN wasn't there, BBC wasn't there, New York Times wasn't there. Well, we just decided, look, we'll report this. We'll report this as journalists, but we'll do this by using a network of our own contacts that we had built up. and by what new media could offer. Twitter, the various websites, and lo and behold, in January 2009, just as an example of how information changes, there was a doctor in Gaza City, a retired doctor. He called up his daughter, who was in North Carolina, and said, I'm seeing people who have burns on their arms, on exposed skin. Not all over their body, just spot burns on their arms. And he described further symptoms, and I looked at a colleague, and we both looked at each other and said at the same time, that's white phosphorus. And so we checked, and you know white phosphorus is banned in built-up areas under international law. And the Israelis said, no, we're not using that. Not casting any aspersions on the current Israeli delegation. We decided we were going to report it, and we reported that story 3 days before the BBC dared to break it. The mainstream media would not break it until they actually saw white phosphorus shells that were bursting in the sky. That's not to say we're better than they were. That's to say that the media environment was changing. And it changed further for us in Iran 2009, when we decided we would cover Iran on a day-to-day basis because of the mass protest. And we still do on a day-to-day basis. We decided that with the so-called Arab Spring, we would cover the Middle East on a day-to-day basis, and we still do. We specialize primarily in Syria. That's where we put our main efforts. But we also have stories today on Iraq and Egypt, for example. And we did it because of two things. One is that information is changing rapidly. Therefore, media is changing. So just the old idea of all the news that's fit to print, that New York Times masthead, doesn't hold up anymore. And secondly, we did it because we don't believe that this is a U.S.-centered world. We believe that the world has to be read from the ground up. The Americans have influence, certainly. The Europeans may have influence. The Russians may have influence, but it's from the ground up that politics is being made and negotiated. So, on information and disinformation, you stop me if I ramble, okay? Let me talk to you a bit about information and disinformation as the first of the two areas I want to talk about. New media environment means a new diplomatic environment. The whole idea that you could control media just through the idea of press releases, the standard thing at, coming out of the UN Security Council, or coming out of the various summits, or coming out of the talks like U.S.-Iran 5+1 nuclear talks, doesn't work that way. There is always stories, so there's always information or rumor that's circulating and flying. So the idea that you can control or define the media environment doesn't work. Now on the surface, more information means more opportunities. We wouldn't exist. I wouldn't be able to work as a journalist as well as an academic on a daily basis if we didn't have this change in the media environment. But it also means more challenges as well. And that is that everybody who's in this game, whether it's diplomats, whether it's various agencies of government, intelligence agencies, foreign offices, State Departments, presidential offices, prime minister offices, they know this. The sharper people in the media environment, they know this. They know that there's chatter out there, they know there's rumor out there, and they know there's disinformation out there. And the challenge is never to say that you're completely right. You never have, at least I would never say I'm completely right. Never say I have the answers. But as best as you can, whether you're a diplomat, a journalist, an academic, cut through the chatter, cut through the disinformation. So let me give you, because we're going to have question and answer. Good. I believe in good, spirited question and answer. Full and frank, as the British say in their diplomatic cables, right? You know what that means. Full and frank in a British diplomatic cable means they basically got into a fist fight behind it. They never will say that openly if you're a British diplomat. Give you a controversy example. Our news cycle, because I got things like, being a day job as an academic, annoying kids, fixing breakfast. Day starts about 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning to pick up on the overnight news. And the goal is, before I have to fix breakfast or whatever, we've got the first items out for the day. So the morning of August 20th, 2013, I wake up, I'm in communication with another staff member, and both of us at the same time, well, there was an expletive that was uttered, right? And then it's probably the closest I've ever come to just losing it when trying to report, because what happened is we were getting the images of victims of the chemical weapons attacks just outside of Damascus. Now, we knew within a few hours, and I won't describe it in detail, unless you want to draw it out question and answer. We knew within a few hours that there were several sites that had been hit outside of Damascus. We knew it was probably sarin that was involved because we talked to a doctor and we described the conditions. We were hearing the conditions, the medical symptoms, and so on. He said, probably sarin. He was right. We knew that these sites were spread out across a very wide range around Damascus, which was a fairly large area. We knew that from the distribution that it could not be homemade rockets. Homemade rockets could not have dropped this much. So we knew that the Assad regime had carried out a chemical weapons attack. There had always been questions for months about whether they had been doing this. We were always cautious in saying whether they used chemical weapons. This time we made the judgment call within 24 hours as chemical weapons. And we stuck to it ever since. And we stuck to it because as important as the information was the disinformation. Several hours after the attacks, the Russian foreign minister came out with a statement which said, we believe a homemade weapon was used. They initially denied anything happened. They said, we believe a homemade weapon was used. Well, the little things you know are very useful. Here's one of the little things that's helpful to know. The Russians have a propaganda office, have a press office, propaganda office in the Syrian presidential palace in Damascus. That's why a lot of information, if you map across Russian official websites, Syrian official websites, Iranian official websites, it looks pretty much the same. Within a few days, the story is going around that it must be the insurgents who had attacked their own people. Now look, there's no way. There's no way that you cut through the shadow that happens. The insurgents probably don't have any chemical weapons at all, or sarin. But if they did have sarin, they didn't have sarin for at least 7 different weapons fired on 7 different sites. And they certainly didn't have the rockets that were used in the attack. Russian-made rockets, Soviet-made rockets, and volcano rockets. They don't. They've never had a rocket. But I can sit and tell you this, and the fact is, information, whether you're a diplomat or journalist, truth doesn't always win. The goal of the disinformation campaign from the Russians was not necessarily to prove that the insurgents had done this. It was to muddy the waters, to keep just enough doubt out there, because what the Russians didn't want, from a diplomatic and military standpoint, is they did not want an intervention by the U.S., Britain, and France, a military intervention in Syria in terms of airstrikes. They succeeded. That strategy succeeded. You know the story generally that the Americans switched diplomatic tack, and instead of keeping pressure on Assad, joined the Russians in what is called the Geneva political process, which is going through its latest phase this week with some fairly hopeless talks between a token opposition and the Syrian regime in Moscow. That's it. I wish I could give you a good story to come out with it. But the fact of the matter is, that's the way the world works. And on a day like today, when you have had insurgents, contrary to the story, the mainstream media narratives, which have become very simplistic, Assad is winning. Jabhat al-Nusra, they are the insurgency, they control all of it. An insurgent coalition is making significant advances today in northwest Syria, and have been advancing in recent weeks. We've had a bomb in the Sinai Peninsula that killed, or bombings and gun attacks that have killed up to 30 people across the peninsula, the latest in a series of attacks. Yemen may or may not have a government in the near future, and it may or may not be a government which is dominated by the Saudis or the Iranians or the West, depending on how you want to spin the theory. We have had in Iraq another day of instability with the Islamic State attacking Kirkuk. But that isn't just simple of Islamic State versus Iraq, because they're attacking Kurdish forces. And that's not to mention the fact that I think there was a little flare-up a few days ago between Israel and Hezbollah. That's the way the world works. That's the world, that second area of my talk, that diplomats face. I can only give you my personal opinion on this. Y'all are going to become the experts. Y'all are the ones that got to do the tough calls in the next couple days. But from my standpoint, it requires a quicker and more supple type of diplomacy. And what it requires is, in many cases, checking your assumptions at the door. It's interesting because from an academic point of view, a lot of my colleagues who are political scientists, and they're great. I mean, they tolerate me. So anybody that tolerates me is great, right? But political scientists, they like to go for models, right? They like to go for the game theory, and they like to go for rational actor models, and sometimes constructivist models. I don't use models. Things don't fit. They don't fit, right? They don't fit in a way like an easy model of shuttle diplomacy. An easy model of shuttle diplomacy says that Henry Kissinger is the world's greatest statesman, which he tried to demonstrate this week again before Congress. A not so easy, basically a different version of approaching diplomacy, building from the ground, would say he probably should have been tried for war crimes. Oh, sorry. That's not. Don't repeat that outside this room. I'm present here. Diplomats should not come in with assumptions about their own country or about the other side. To give you one other example which crosses between diplomacy and media, we're in the middle of some very sensitive talks, nuclear talks between the U.S., Iran, European powers, China. A few days ago, 3 guys show up in the Washington Post. A man named Dennis Ross, who used to be in the National Security Council and State Department. Someone named Eric Edelman, who worked in the Department of Defense under Ronald Reagan. And someone that I used to co-write with, Ray Takei, former State Department, National Security Council, now the Council on Foreign Relations. We know, they said, we know. I don't know how they know. We know that Iran is spinning out the talks. We know that they are likely to cheat on any agreement. We know this. So we know that we have to use coercive diplomacy to make any agreement work. And I'm going, A, you don't know that. B, the Iranians are far too complex to either say they're always truthful or always cheating. And C, if you use coercive diplomacy, you watch how quickly the talks fall apart and we're into a world of even more pain in the Middle East. Not that they would listen. So where possible, being able to be supple, quicker, and to read the situation from the other side's eyes. As an academic, the thing that's always helped me most, put the models aside. Get inside the head of who you're writing about. Get inside the head of Prime Minister Anthony Eden in the 1950s, who used to talk to flowers. And so American statesmen thought he was gay. You don't see that in British history books, right? That affected diplomacy, right? Get inside the head of Winston Churchill, who when he went to summits with the Americans and the French in the 1950s, used to turn down his hearing aid whenever the French premier spoke. Or you get into the head of a Putin, of an Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, of a Bashar al-Assad, of a Barack Obama, or their various officials. So in conclusion, so we can turn it over to your smarter minds. And on a personal note, it's a nasty world out there. It's a really nasty world. I know this isn't what you want to hear, right? I would say this, that you cannot fail. You try to be objective. You cannot fail to separate yourself from events. And I can tell you that in 2011, at the start of 2011, on the day that Mubarak fell in Egypt, Tahrir, before that, in 2009, when you had millions on the streets of Iran, you felt the surge of hope, right? You felt the surge of hope, like in Tunisia when Ben Ali went. You felt that maybe it's going to be a better world for all of us in various ways. And it hadn't turned out that way. That's why I always have to say so-called Arab Spring. That was a media construction. We knew it at the time. We knew it might not turn out flowers with bloom. A lot of good people, including some friends, have died since then. They've been killed. Some have left their homes. Some may not ever see their homes again. So this is serious stuff, right? But on the other hand, whenever it gets rough, people would not protest. Many people would not go into diplomacy or go into activism if they thought the world was only a nasty place. Because if the world's only a nasty place, screw it, let's just all get drunk. Or, if you don't believe in alcohol, choose your favorite non-alcoholic beverage. You know, we'll just party on till the time goes. You hold on to hope is why you go into diplomacy, where you go into journalism, where you go into activism. Because there aren't final answers. There's never final answers. Marx was wrong. God knows Francis Fukuyama was wrong. He said history ended in 1992. There's always challenges, challenges after challenges. But following on from what the President said, why these sessions are valuable? Because it is in addressing the challenges that somehow you keep possibility and hope alive, no matter how many lies, how many tricks, and how many deceptions, sometimes quite deadly, are played. Thank you very much for listening.
So now we're going to take some questions. We've got some. Would you like to take one?
I'd love to see just one hand go up to start with. Okay.
Got one hand up.
You mentioned the situation in Israel against the amounts of violence and deaths in surrounding countries. Would you say that the West has respected that Western lives and Western allied lives mean more to the situation than anyone else's lives?
You're teasing me there. You know what the answer is? The first thing is that it's the nature of nations that the lives of their nationals are always going to be the ones that get priority. We used to have a running joke, a very good satirical program in the 1980s. Spitting Image used to parody a newscaster who would say, hundreds have died in an earthquake in India, or hundreds have died in violence in Africa. 2 of them were British, right? The fact is that from certain political cultures, the American political culture is an example. If you want to get provocative about this, Israeli lives matter more than the lives of Gazans or of people in the West Bank. And if we have an Israeli-Hezbollah war, that we won't, but if we have one, they'll matter more than Lebanese. And that's not making a value judgment on anyone being right or wrong. That's just simply, my father's a preacher, by the way. As religious people, we learn about the Jews, we learn about the Israelis, and most of American political culture turns upon that. Now that's changing to an extent, because the new media environment, I told you the story about Al Jazeera English being reported from Gaza. A few Americans would have noticed that. It would have changed the perspective just a bit. The problem is that the way that political culture and media works, Al Jazeera English is not allowed on, or has not been able to get on, what's now Al Jazeera America, many cable networks. I was covering that Gaza war at Christmas, so I was actually visiting my parents. So I get up every morning and I get on the computer. And my sister came down absolutely pale-faced and said, "Oh my God, you've been on Al Jazeera." I go, "Yes." "The FBI will be coming after us." And that's just the notion that, the way that the spin is that the Israelis fight the valiant wars, they built up that land, they made the flowers bloom. I'm generalizing a bit, but for many people this is the way it works. Whereas the Arabs betrayed, fought, connived against them. So to give you one example, this is a very good question, but I'm trying to tie this to current events. I was in a class last semester. I teach a class on America and the Middle East through politics and film. But I just simply, for some reason, mentioned Sabra and Shatila. How many of you heard of what happened at Sabra and Shatila in 1982? A few hands. How many of you, now be honest, how many of you have not heard of this? That's a fair enough answer. My bet is that if you grew up in the Middle East, you would know about Sabra and Shatila. Because this is more than 700 predominantly refugees who were killed in 1-2 days by Israeli and local Lebanese Christian forces. Only one person in my class of 40 people knew of Sabra and Shatila. And she happened to be French Tunisian. And that's not saying these are bad students. These were great students. but they had not grown up in a culture that privileged that information. Now let me ask you another question, to be honest with you. How many of you have heard of the Holocaust? Okay? Political culture affects us in various ways, and therefore in the current conflicts between Israel and Palestine, media is shaped in a lot of ways. New media can challenge or try to reshape this, but it doesn't particularly redefine it. The New York Times reporters who are based in Israel, Ethan Bronner, his son, this is not to say Bronner's not a good journalist, but his son had served in the Israel Defense Forces. Jody Ruderin does not speak or read Arabic. She doesn't have that many sources in the West Bank or in Gaza. Therefore, the New York Times reporting on Israel and Palestine will have a particular trajectory, because that's just where the reporters come from. Is that a starting point for answering?
I have a question for you about vision, the American vision sometimes of the news, and maybe whose fault is it? I can give you an example. We, as some American journalists said, are supposed to be in a Muslim city.
Was that in the video, by the way?
And some of us are supposed to come from a state that sometimes and somewhere applies Sharia law, which is technically ridiculous. Even if we are just used of this media being ridiculous all the time. But this is quite important media. This is quite very, very much watchers in America. And maybe not all of them, but lots of them trust what they say. So, how the biggest country and the most powerful country in the world can understand the world if half its citizens doesn't even understand the world?
It's a good question, but I'm going to give you an answer with a sting in the tail, because I'm going to give you the easy answer. Followed for more than 30 years. I knew Stephen Emerson when he worked as a journalist, and then he became an academic. He's in a think tank now. And he comes on and says that, let me just make sure I get it right, not only that there are no-go areas in Birmingham, the entire city is a no-go area. Now, I live approximately 1.5 miles from this campus, which I believe is still within the Birmingham city limits. My father is a Protestant preacher. My wife is not Muslim. My 2 children are not Muslim. So she brought this report up on Facebook as I'm watching it and said, "Look, did you know this?" I said, "I do now." Within an hour, I had friends of mine who are Muslim who were calling me up and congratulating me on my conversion. So I mean, and the thing is that here's first of all, it's that in the new media world, because we could learn about that idiotic comment, it was able to kick back against it. If that comment had been made a generation ago or 20 years ago, it would have stood for a long time, right? When Fox first started, because it wouldn't have raced around on social media as much. So the easy part of the story is that you can sort of expose this, you can poke fun at it. So you know the hashtag Fox News Facts, right? The Queen forced to wear hijab, which shows her in her headscarf, right? Looking not very happy about it. The bull ring, which you saw beautifully up there, was put in a burqa. The new media world allows you to negotiate and to ring it, but that's too simple an answer, and it's a too simple an answer for 2 reasons. The first is that there were things that Stephen Emerson said in that interview that got through because they weren't as easy to kick back on. Remember, he said that Islamic religious police were on the streets of London harassing and beating up people. What? And I'm going, I'm not quite sure about that, Steve. And then he said, all of Europe, not just part of it, all of Europe is doomed because local Islamic leaders will not integrate. And nobody challenged that, right? That was the thing, because it was like everybody was like, Birmingham. And Fox, of course, apologized for Emerson's statement, but they've made some outrageous statements since then, because that's the way Fox operates. Fox doesn't give a damn about reporting. It's not journalism. It is polemic because it wants to make political points, depending on who they back, and it wants to make money, so it uses reader bait. I mean, that's the way it works. But it's not the only outlet to do it. Here's the sting in the tail. We can jab at the American media, and it is fun, right? But you know what? I can have some swings at the British media as well, right? So I could have some swings at the British media. For example, you got two boys. They are boys. They're just about young men. They are only about 20, 21. They're from Birmingham. I don't know if you know this. They went to Syria and they posed with some guns, and they did some cheers, Takbir, Allah Akbar, and then some ones that were big extremists. And those guys got 13-year sentences, right? Did you know this? When the sentences were announced, the British media said that these boys had gone off to fight for Al-Qaeda. Absolutely untrue. They joined a Syrian faction that is not part of Al-Qaeda, it's not connected with it. Nobody really stood up and challenged it, because it wasn't fun, you couldn't do it, right? And let me guess, we got some folks from France here? Yeah, hi. Spain? Anybody from Denmark? I play this game with my students as well. Germany? I can go around to every country's media and pick out cases for you to have fun with. And you know the fact that everybody's got, well, this is, Der Bild is not known as being the icon of respectability in Germany. France does have tabloid press as well. Right? No? Okay. We're going to have some. What I'm saying is that it's not just a question of looking at the Americans. It's like, this is terrible. It's a decentered world. So two things. One is go wider. Look at the media more broadly. But secondly, realize it's not the American media that necessarily calls the shots anymore. Right? The fact is that the rise of non-American outlets, and this again is why I can work as a professor and work as a journalist with a very small staff and not go crazy, because I don't go to the Americans if I want to go and cross-check my news. I go to Al Jazeera, but I also go to the Iranian outlets that publish in English now. I don't necessarily believe them, but I want to see what they're reporting. I go to MAN News Agency, or Electronic Intifada, on 972, on Palestine. I go to Akbar Arham Online, and other Egyptian outlets. It's a multifaceted media world, but you have to be willing to negotiate it. And if you go into diplomacy, you've got to be willing to negotiate it. And I know a lot of diplomats out there, I'm going to be honest with you, they still follow the routine of New York Times, Washington Post. Those newspapers are often behind the news cycle now. And it's not the way that I work as a journalist, and it's not the way I would work as a diplomat either.
Okay, one more question and then we'll wrap up.
Take a few and I'll take a few together and I'll be
Okay.
okay.
Yes.
Yeah, my question in general, how you see the future of new media? Will there be a crackdown by states, or this blessed age of new media will continue?
Okay, let's take a couple more.
There was another question? Yes.
I wondered how did we get to the point that we cannot believe anymore the media, and if you think that it has always been like that, or if it's just that we have a massive media generation.
How do you see our chances this weekend and in the Middle East in general in finding peace?
Go ahead, take the other point real quick, because that's a question and we'll...
I was going to ask, how a person that's not exposed to an international environment and who's set in his own ways for thousands of years or hundreds of years, like Eastern Europe or most of Eastern Europe, can get any sort of an objective information while only seeing one side of things throughout his entire life?
Do you think the future of like new media also depends on whether people actually want to hear the whole truth like a lot of the time? Because it seems like the actual media serves what the people want to hear.
I've got a lot of cynics out there. This is great. Okay. I've got two general areas. I've got a lot of great questions on the future of media, how media, the dynamics of it, and then I get to solve all the Middle East problems, right? Okay. hang on to this word, and hang on to two words here. One is negotiations, and I mean in a wider sense than diplomacy, although that's an important part of it, and possibilities. And remember, there's never final answers, there's only challenges. On the media side, not being able to believe the media is not a recent phenomenon, right? You might know the famous story in the United States about William Randolph Hearst in the late 19th century, what we call the yellow press. He basically started up a whole range of newspapers. His interest lay in he wanted to stoke up a war with the Spanish over Cuba, and he actually created, in a way, or exaggerated this story that they had attacked a ship, which led to the Spanish-American War. The slogan is, "Remember the Maine," the ship that blew up. Those were exaggerations, distortions. That was the Fox News of the day, if you want it, right? So this is not a new phenomenon. So your question is an ongoing one, right? And I just simply say that because I don't ever believe there was a golden age of media where, as the New York Times would have it, everything was laid out for us, and we could be completely informed and know the world sitting over breakfast and reading the newspapers, or later on watching the evening news on television. That raises the question, I think, of where new media fits into the future of new media. The thing that drives me crazy a bit is, it drives me crazy because if I wanted to make a lot of money, I would just go this route, and I just probably not smart enough to do it, or quite quick enough, and that is, you jump on it and you either say new media is absolutely rubbish and overblown and it's terrible, and I am a really smart man who you can believe, Evgeny Morozov, author of The Net Delusion. Or you say, new media is fantastic, the internet's wonderful, it's like a global village out there, it's going to be sunshine and cupcakes and freedom for everyone, Clay Shirky. Well, that's not the way that media works. Media is not an end in itself. It's a tool, it's a vehicle, it's a space. You use that space and you negotiate that space. And each of us negotiates that space as individuals. And the future of new media, simply from my standpoint, is simply that I can have my own negotiation in that space in a much different way than I could a decade ago by being a practitioner in it, right? By writing, by talking to people about it, by building up networks of contacts. And I think you're going to have a much more diffuse media environment. That leads to the specific question about negotiating it, or even if you're not in contact with it, how do you not negotiate it? There's always a useful story for me when I used to learn about Russian and Soviet history that you all may know, and that is that the way that the Bolshevik Revolution sort of spread propaganda or furthered itself is it couldn't reach a lot of people in the Soviet Union. So, for example, it would just simply print a couple of sheets of Pravda, still in existence today. And is it Pravda that means truth? I think Pravda is one. They print truth, and they put it up in a public square. And you get some people who would read it, and then they would tell other people, and then they would tell other people, right? Later on, they would show films and do it that way. When there was a big debate over the really silly term Twitter revolution, Twitter is not an end in itself, it's a tool, right? But when there was a debate over the Twitter revolution in 2009, people said, well, most of Iranians aren't connected up to Twitter, up to the internet, right? They missed the point. A few people were on Twitter, but those people then spoke to other people about what they were saying, about what was coming in and out. They spoke to others, and so you had a chain of communication that takes place. Does that mean it reaches everybody? No, absolutely not. But even, say, in Eastern Europe, which was your case study, so if you were to take, say, something like the Ukraine, which is obviously a frontline case right now, it's a much more fluid situation in terms of propaganda and information. It's not just simply that Russia today is controlling everybody or the Western media is controlling everybody. And we can talk about that more, because I've got a colleague who's doing a study on it right now. But that brings me back to the point, and that is, I think we like to go for the grand answers, which is, let's solve everything about the media, just making a small impact for the media. Your own personal intervention in new media and in networks of others makes a difference. 2 minutes, because these guys are ready to go into crisis mode, and I can see it. How are we going to solve the Middle East? Very quickly. You can't. Americans can't solve the Middle East. French can't solve the Middle East, British can't solve the Middle East. The people who can solve the problems in the Middle East are people in the countries themselves. It's Syrians who will have to solve the problem on Syria. It's Palestinians who will have to solve the problem on Palestine. It's Egyptians who will have to solve the problems on Egypt. All I can do from the outside is just simply interact, negotiate in my own way, which is to get information out, which I hope is reliable for people to consider, which is to expose disinformation when I see it, which is to hail what I think might be the good in terms of diplomacy, and to announce what I think would be the bad, such as inaction, caution. It may be 5 years, 10 years, it may be, heaven help us, it's been how many years since Palestinians were dislocated? But all you can do is just interact and contribute. So hopefully Palestine gets to join the International Criminal Court. Small step. Hopefully there are no-fly zones in Syria to protect some Syrians to have a space to make their visions known. Hopefully someone can approach Libya without just simply calling it extremist militia. And then some people say, wouldn't it be nicer if that Mr. Gaddafi was back? Which I'm not sure the majority of Libyans would necessarily agree with. That's what you do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now that I actually do not have a speech, I can actually be myself. Thank you very much, Professor, because that was absolutely impressive. I'm actually quite happy that we developed so much on the information aspect, because in our conference you will see that journalism will play a fantastic part. And the information on the misinformation might really play with your plans. Again, you are now the countries that we've discussed, and you now have a chance to make it right. So, without further ado, I'd like to...
Sorry, I'm going to have to open. But we have an emergency. Ladies and gentlemen, we have some breaking news coming in that requires...
Could we end it up? Sorry, ladies.
I better get back to the journal so I can report it.
Not loud enough.
Breaking news currently coming in from Baghdad, where gun battles have erupted in the streets of the Iraqi capital. Reports indicate government forces are fighting unidentified insurgents who have quickly seized several neighborhoods and are moving closer to the Prime Minister's compound. Eyewitness accounts seem to indicate the possibility that ISIS is behind this attack. We'll try to keep you updated as more information comes to this desk, but for now, stay tuned.
Okay, you just heard what happened. There's gun battles in Baghdad.
I think we should actually cut this down short. I think we've got work to do.
Yeah,
So I declare the 6th annual edition of UoBMAL